Okay, Baruchim Abba, welcome everyone. We're continuing a major topic, major subject that we began last week on the halachic status of Gaza. Baruchim Abba to the Kol Agar de Pirka Monday National Shir. We welcome everyone who's joining us. This shir got very wide coverage on our first segment, and today we hope to complete the topic. The question is, what is the halachic status of Gaza in halacha? Last week we learned that there are three various statuses in Eretz Yisrael. There's the Eretz Yisrael that was promised to Avraham Avinu, which extends all the way up in the north from the Har Pras. I'll show you on the map. It includes the areas of Syria. It goes all the way up to the Euphrates River. It includes parts of Aram Tsoiva, Aram Naharayim, Damascus, and so forth. Transjordan, Sinai, all the way up from the Euphrates River until Nachal Mitzrayim. Then there's the land. The land that was promised to Avraham Avinu is the land of the 10 nations. When the Jews entered Eretz Yisrael, when they came out of Egypt, so they conquered the Shiva Amamin. They did not conquer necessarily Ammon, Moav, Edom, and that is promised to Klal Yisrael in the future. So there's the land that was promised to Abraham. There was a land that was there was a land that was conquered by the Oilei Mitzrayim, and there was a land that was conquered by the Oilei Bavel. Because there's a principle, Kidsha Rishayna, Kidsha L'Shaitav, Kidsha L'Asalavai, that just because the Oilei Mitzrayim conquered, it does not mean that it has eternal Kedusha, because once we were thrown out of the land in the times of the Babylonians, so we say the Kedusha left. So last week we were discussing the halachic status of Gaza. Rashi implied, on the one hand, Yitzchak Avinu was never allowed to leave Eretz Yisrael, and yet he went to Gerar, he went to the land of the Philistines, he lived in Gaza. So that certainly implies that Gaza has the status of Eretz Yisrael. At least it's part of Eretz Yisrael that was promised to Abraham, and it has Kedushas Haaretz. On the other hand, Rashi pointed out, it's not the land of the Shiva Amamin. So in other words, it doesn't have the same status as Eretz Yisrael proper. It's not the land of the 7 nations, but rather the Philistines are from Mitzrayim. So it does seem like it's the Eretz Yisrael promised to Abraham. It's a little bit different than the rest of the land. And on the other hand, there's some degree of question as to whether the Oilei Mitzrayim conquered it. And that is, the Rambam seems to say the Oilei Mitzrayim did not conquer Gaza. Because the Rambam seems to say the southern border of Eretz Yisrael is Ashkelon. And Ashkelon is north of Gaza. So the Rambam, as we saw last week, seems to say Gaza perhaps is not part of the Eretz Yisrael of the Oilei Mitzrayim. The Rambam says in Hilchos Trumos, Perek Aleph, Halacha Zayin, the Rambam says, Eza hi haaretz shechziku Oilei Mitzrayim. What is the land that the Oilei Mitzrayim maintained? The Rambam says, Meirekem, which is in the east, until the Yam HaGadol, from Ashkelon, which is in the south. So the Rambam says the southern border of Eretz Yisrael is Ashkelon, which is north of Gaza. The simple reading of the Rambam would indicate that Gaza does not have Kedushas Eretz Yisrael. That is the Shita of the Rambam. However, when it comes to halacha, we need to know what the Poskim say. And last week we began seeing the psak of the Radbaz. To review, the opinion of the Radbaz is that he received a question from Gaza: do they have to separate Trumos and Masros? And the Radbaz says, Aza is chayeves midrabanan. The Radbaz says, not like the Rambam. There is no question, says the Radbaz, that Gaza is part of the Eretz Yisrael of the Oilei Mitzrayim, because the Gemara in Gittin says we view like a strip like a string was stretched out from Turei Amnoin until Nachal Mitzrayim, which according to most is Wadi al-Arish, and whatever is in that strip is considered Eretz Yisrael of the Oilei Mitzrayim. So going down to the map, you have a imaginary line going down from Har HaHar in the northwest of Israel, going all the way down to Wadi al-Arish, and obviously Gaza then would be included. So it is part of Eretz Yisrael of the Nachal Mitzrayim. However, because Gaza is about a 2-day distance north of Wadi al-Arish, and therefore, even though it does seem like the Oilei Bavel did not conquer Gaza, it would have biblical Kedushas Eretz Yisrael, but it would not be Chayiv in Shumas and Masros Midda Oiraisa, because only lands that were conquered by Ezra would have Chayiv and Shuma Maisa Midda Oiraisa. So it would only be Chayiv and Shuma Midrabanan. And furthermore, says the Radbaz, I found that the great traveler, the Kaftar Vaferach, a student of Harav Zal, who writes that Gaza is included in Eretz Yisrael. Okay, so that was the Shita of the Radbaz. But today I want to sort of close this topic, but not before you need to be aware of the very surprising opinion of the Maharit. The Maharit was Rabbi Yosef Mitrani, one of the Amudei Hoira, and he was asked a question. There was a man by the name of Shimon who lived in one of the beautiful cities in Yehuda. It's called Gaza, which was a very expansive land for business. It had gardens, orchards, and it was like Gan Eden. And Shimon was a merchant there, and he bought merchandise from Levi, one of the businessmen of the city, and the merchandise burnt down, and Shimon needed to run away from Gaza until he figured out how to compromise with Levi. So he went to Egypt. He got married in Egypt, and he was successful in Egypt. Shimon had 2 children there, and these 2 sons married. Shimon always had in mind he was going to return back to Gaza. In the meanwhile, Shimon died, and his children decided they're going to go back to the land of their fathers because they were having issues with the Egyptians, and the 2 sons decided they're going to return back to Gaza. The wife of the first brother, she very happily agreed to go back to Gaza. The other brother, the wife didn't want to go along, and he could not convince her. So he goes to Gaza, he leaves her in Egypt, and he sees that things are good in Gaza, and a lot of people remembered his father. He felt he could be successful there. He wrote her many times, please come back with me to Gaza. She refused. He goes back to her. There's nothing he could do to impress upon her how much he wants to return. And now the question is, can he force her to go back to Gaza? Could he marry another wife in addition to her because she doesn't want to come with him? And what should he do? So says the Maharit, says Rabbi Yosef Mitrani, again one of the Amudei Hoira. He says, the Shoyal asked very wisely, because it is true, Gaza is one of the Orei Yehuda. And it is, you would think then it has the status of Eretz Yisrael, and anything that has the status of Eretz Yisrael, the halacha is, one spouse could force the other spouse to go to Eretz Yisrael. However, says the Maharit, in my humble opinion, uva'aniyusi, in my humble opinion, it would appear that this question was brought up to the rabbis, and the opinion of the rabbis is that Gaza is not considered part of Israel for all matters. What's the proof? Don't you remember the first Mishnah in Gittin? The first Mishnah in Gittin says, if you bring a get from Rekem and to the east, it's Chutz La'aretz, and Rekem is like the east. From Ashkelon and south, and Ashkelon is like the south, which means Ashkelon is considered part of Chutz La'aretz for Gittin. And certainly, Gaza which is much further south than Ashkelon, would have the halachic status of chutz la'aretz. So says Maharit, in my opinion, there's no question over here. It's explicitly in the very first Mishnah in Gittin, even Ashkelon is not part of Eretz Yisrael. Certainly Gaza. But then the Maharit says that whenever we don't know what to do in halacha, we apply the principle, Puk chazi ma ama daber. Go see what people are doing. And all Jews who lived in Gaza from time immemorial, they always considered Gaza chutz la'aretz. And our early Chachamim who lived in Yerushalayim considered it chutz la'aretz regarding Shumas and Masros and Shvius, because most of the fruits that grow in Yerushalayim come from Gaza. By the way, one thing you see from here, that Gaza was always the most fertile part of Eretz Yisrael, that the majority of produce in Yerushalayim used to come from Gaza. And says the Maharit, well, what are you telling me if we don't know what to do? See what people are doing. Are people that learned that we could bring a proof in halacha from the way people do things? Says the Radbaz, says the Maharit, HaKabbalah v'Hamasa amud gadol b'hayrahu. The tradition and what people do is a great pillar in Psak. And therefore there's no doubt that since it's not considered part of Eretz Yisrael, regarding the mitzvahs that are nohagba, it's like chutz la'aretz gemura for everything. So the Maharit now says a very big chiddush, that if it's considered chutz la'aretz for truma and maser, then probably it's chutz la'aretz for everything. Why? Because the ear then of Gaza is tamei. Like the Gemara in Ezra brings a story about Rabbi Yossi HaKohen, that he became tamei to follow his Rebbe in Sidon, even though Sidon is part of Eretz Yisrael, but it wasn't conquered. So certainly Gaza would be considered tamei, even though. Okay, let's follow this. His logic. Even though the Kaftar of Perach says that except for Maser and Mitzvahs, there's no difference in Kedusha between what Ezra conquered and what he didn't conquer, meaning the opinion of the Kaftar of Perach is even though perhaps certain areas are not Chayv and Shuma and Meiser because Ezra didn't conquer it, but doesn't it have Kedushas Eretz Yisrael? Says the Maharit, that's his opinion. But my opinion is that the laws of Kedushas Eretz Yisrael are dependent on the laws of Shumas and Masros. And since it's not Chayv and Shumas and Masros, therefore it's considered Tameh, like Chutz la'aretz, like the Gemara in Eruvin teaches us. Meaning, he disagrees with the Kaftar V'Ferach, and he says if a location is not Chayv and Shumas and Masros, it's considered Chutz la'aretz. Therefore, says the Maharit, L'kach nirali shekol Eretz Yisrael shaloi kavshu oilei Bavel Yeshla din Surya. And even the blessings that accrued to those who live in Eretz Yisrael were not accrued to those who live in Azra. Therefore, says the Maharit, a spouse cannot force the other spouse to live in Gaza. In other words, if you live in New York and you tell your wife, yeah, great, guess what, I have good news. I don't know where things are going in this country, and I bought a brand new room, a beautiful condominium overlooking the water. Really, where? In Tiberia? No. Much nicer. Tiberia is only overlooking a lake. Where? By the Yama, by Masada, overlooking the Yama. No, much nicer. Where's the new room? They have very inexpensive rooms in Shifa Hospital. You could get a really good deal overlooking the Mediterranean Sea. That's where we're heading. This way we're overlooking the water. It's beautiful there. You can get really good deals. And don't worry, there's basement. You should see there are a lot of subterranean storage areas in the basement over there. We could keep all the junk we collected over the last 70 years. There's miles and miles of basement there. No, you can't force your wife to go to Gaza. Why? Says Maharit, it's chutz la'aretz. Okay? Now again, don't start cutting out clips from this year. The newest thing, you give a shir for an hour and then people pass it off. Oh, you heard what he said? And they clip off 2 words. You don't have no idea what the context is. But I'm telling you what the Maharit holds. Therefore, says Maharit, one spouse cannot force the other spouse to live in Gaza. And furthermore, says the Maharit says that Gaza, compared to Mitzrayim, is like a big city to a hick town. And because in Gaza you don't have doctors like in Mitzrayim, and you don't have medical practices like in Mitzrayim, and the halacha is that a city that's mostly Jews to a city that's mostly Goyim, you can't force a spouse to go to. And even the Jews that live in Gaza are only the minority compared to the Jews that are in Egypt. And there are no yeshivas in Gaza. And there's nobody who knows how to learn in Gaza. And you don't even have someone who opens up a sefer. V'afilu poisech sefer ein ba. So how could you take your wife out of Mitzrayim, which is a makom tamich chachamim? It's an er gedolah of chachamim and soifrim. Therefore, says Maharit, my psak is Gaza is chutz la'aretz, and you can force one spouse, cannot force another spouse to leave. And ultimately, the main proof the Maharit brings is from the first Mishnah in Gittin that even Ashkelon is part of chutz la'aretz. So if I would ask you right now, is Gaza part of Eretz Yisrael? The answer would be it's machlokes Radbaz and Maharit. The Radbaz says it was conquered by the Oilei Mitzrayim. It was not conquered by the Oilei Bavel. It's chayv in Shumas Amaisus Midrabanan. But regarding Kedushas Eretz Yisrael, it has full-fledged Kedushas Eretz Yisrael, and therefore one spouse could force another spouse to go there. On the other hand, Maharit says from the Gemara in the beginning of Gittin, from the first Mishnah in Gittin, it's considered chutz la'aretz. It was not conquered by the Oilei Bavel. It's unclear if the Oilei Mitzrayim conquered it. It does not have Kedushas Eretz Yisrael, and it's certainly not chayv and Shumas Amaisros. So it would be a big machlokes. And in fact, in the book Contemporary Halachic Problems of Rabbi Bleich, he brings from a Rabbi Gershuni, who makes an interesting observation regarding the halachic status of Gaza, that the Radbaz asserts Gaza was definitely conquered by those who ascended Egypt, but expresses uncertainty with regard to its resettlement in the days of Ezra. However, this view is contradicted by Rabbi Yitzchak Mitrani in Maharit. There was a man who had married in Gaza and wished his wife to accompany him. Maharit was asked whether the wife could be compelled to do so, since the wife must join her husband settling in Eretz Yisrael. Essentially, the question is whether or not Gaza is considered part of the land of Israel. Maharit's answer was in the negative. He maintained that Gaza was definitely not settled by returnees from Babylonia, and even assuming it was conquered by those who ascended from Egypt, the wife could not be compelled to live there, since commandments contingent upon the land are not observed. But I want to share with you that I think there's a very important tshuva that is not given enough attention and study, and that is the tshuva of Rabbi Yaakov Emden in the Marek Tzia regarding the Gidrei Yishuv Eretz Yisrael. Says Rabbi Yaakov Emden that in his opinion it's similar to Surya, and regarding Kedusha and Mitzvahs Yishuv Eretz Yisrael, it's more than Surya. Even though the Pelishtim are not Canaanim, because Mitzrayim was the firstborn son of Cham, and Mitzrayim is a progenitor of the Plishtim. And in fact, it was given to Klal Yisrael as a nachala, even if though it's not from the Shiva Amamin. Says Rabbi Yaakov Emden, it was given to Klal Yisrael as a nachala. Because Klal Yisrael, now listen very carefully, Klal Yisrael conquered the land from the Plishtim when they came out of Egypt. When did they conquer it? In the times of Shoftim Harishonim. So it sounds like, not necessarily in the times of Yehoshua, but in the times of the Shoftim, they conquered. The pasuk says, Vayilkod Yehuda es Aza. Therefore, it's no different than Kibush Rishon, which is bigger, which is better than Kibush Yachid. So it has a status in a way of Oilei Mitzrayim. Now says Rabbi Yaakov Emden, it's one of the only areas of Oilei Mitzrayim that the Goyim took back. Because even though the Plishtim rebelled, but then they was reconquered in the times of David, Shlomo, and Uzziah. And this is therefore not called Kibush Yachid, but it's called Kibush Rabim. There's a difference between lands that were conquered by individual kings of Israel and lands that were conquered by all of Israel when they left Egypt. Says Rabbi Yaakov Emden, since all of Israel basically conquered in the times of the Shoftim, even though the Philistines later rebelled, but we took it back, it has a status of Kibush Rabim. And listen to this is a whopper of a Chiddush. He says it's possible it could be considered land that Ezra reconquered. But we don't find that when Ezra returned in times of the second Beis HaMikdash, Ezra got as far as Gaza. Listen to this whopper. But 200 years later, in the times of the kings of the Chashmonim and Hordis of Herod, they conquered many lands that Ezra didn't get to, and they reached all the way to the sea, and probably they reached Gaza, but we don't know exactly what. It is possible, says Rabbi Yaakov Emden, that in the times of Chanukah, they conquered all the way till Gaza. Now, we don't really know what has the status of Kibush Ezra. Was it Ezra himself, or did that era extend a little bit? If it extended a little bit, and the Jews in fact conquered it, let's say in the times of Chanukah, even though it was later than the Oilei Bavel, then Gaza might even be chayiv in Shumas and Masros da'iraisa. That would be unbelievable. Now, comes Rabbi Yaakov Emden, the Maharit wanted to prove that Gaza has the status of Chutz Aretz, because regarding Hilchos Gittin, even Ashkelon has the status of Chutz Aretz. Says Rabbi Yaakov Emden, what in the world do Hilchos Gittin have to do with Hilchos Kedushas Eretz Yisrael? The laws of Gittin are regarding when do you need to say Befanei Nechta, Befanei Nechta. That's dependent not on Kedushas Eretz Yisrael. That's dependent on being knowledgeable in the laws of Gittin, whether you're Bekiyim L'Shema. So there were extremities of Eretz Yisrael that, although it was definitely considered part of Eretz Yisrael, nevertheless it has the status of Chutz La'aretz because they were not knowledgeable in halacha. But there's no question it is absolutely Eretz Yisrael. So just like Ashkelon, the proof is, says Rabbi Yaakov Emden, regarding Hilchos Gittin, Akoy is like Chutz La'aretz. And everyone knows that Akoy has Kedushas Eretz Yisrael. So it must be it's a din specifically for Gittin. Says Rabbi Yaakov Emden. So I checked my suitcase. Now what was in the suitcase of Rabbi Yaakov Emden? Ooh, in the magical suitcase of Rabbi Yaakov Emden, that's where he kept his Shalos Teshuvos. He says, maybe I could find support. Maybe I could find dissenting view. Because ultimately Rabbi Yaakov Emden paskins definitively Gaza is full-fledged Eretz Yisrael. For Kedushas Eretz Yisrael, it has biblical Kedusha. Even for Chumas and Masros, it might even be Chayiv Midairaisa. So I found the Radbaz, who was asked about Aza, and the Radbaz says it's Chayiv in Chumas and Masros Midrabanan. It's part of the Kibush Oilei Mitzrayim, and therefore it's Chayiv Midrabanan. But then I saw the Maharit, who writes the opposite, and he considers Aza like Chutz La'aretz Gemura. Says Rabbi Yaakov Emden, I don't understand what he's talking about. He's going to compare, he's going to derive the laws of Kedushas Eretz Yisrael from the laws of Gittin. He says, I want to read to you his words, B'mechilas kevoidoi ein mizeh raya shel klum. With all due respect, this is not a proof at all. That's regarding Hilchos Gittin, like Tosfos says explicitly. Akoy is Eretz Yisrael, just regarding Gittin it's not. Friends, if you remember from last week, one of the reasons why we wanted to discuss this topic is that we were contemplating that the reason why Gaza has been such a difficult land to conquer and has been such a sore spot for the Jewish people, we maintained was because the Torah that corresponds to Gaza is so elusive and unclear to us And we learned how each part of Eretz Yisrael corresponds to a different chelek in Torah. In order to conquer that part of Eretz Yisrael, you need to master that part of Torah. In any event, says Rabbi Yaakov Emden, he vehemently disagrees with the Maharit. It's definitely part of Eretz Yisrael. Maybe it's not part of Kibush Ezra. The Maharit says, well, let's look around and see how people treat Gaza. Isn't that of value? Don't all the rabbis in Yerushalayim consider Gaza part of Chutz Haaretz? Says Rabbi Yaakov Emden, that's a tema. Really? All the rabbis considered Chutz Haaretz? Was the Radbaz not a rabbi? Did the Radbaz not live in Yerushalayim? And he's saying it has a biblical status of Eretz Yisrael for Kedushas Haaretz, and it's Chayv and Shumas and Masros Midrabanan. So he doesn't buy this idea that from time immemorial it was always considered part of Chutz Haaretz. However, says Rabbi Yaakov Emden, the truth is that we all know the great eminence of the Maharit and his Bekios and his Chachma. And I can't understand how could he decide that Gaza has the status of Chutz Haaretz, even regarding Chumas and Masros. So therefore, says Rabbi Yaakov Emden, it behooves us to try to come up with an approach to reconcile the opinion of the Maharit that Gaza is not part of Eretz Yisrael with the Shita of the Radbaz, who maintains that it absolutely is. And says Rabbi Yaakov Emden, there's no question Gaza was conquered by the Oilei Mitzrayim. So when the Maharit says that from time immemorial, Gaza was always considered part of Chutz Haaretz, Rabbi Yaakov Emden says we have to explain it as follows. We have to say that let me see. We have to say that this is what the Maharit means. What's the halacha? If you go to Eretz Yisrael and you buy produce from a Gentile who owns the land, is it chayiv in Shumas and Masros? Let's say a Gentile owns a field in Hebron. Hebron is definitely part of Eretz Yisrael. And you buy a field from him, you buy produce from him. Are those produce chayiv in Shumas and Masros? Yes. Yeah, but the Gentile owns the land. No. A Gentile does not have the ability to own land in Eretz Yisrael to extricate it from being chayiv in Shumas and Masros. However, says Rabbi Yaakov Emden, that's in Eretz Yisrael proper. But in the Gaza, where Ezra did not reconquer it, so even though typically a guy's ownership of Eretz Yisrael cannot remove it from being chayiv in Shumas and Masros, but in the Gaza, where Ezra never reconquered it, so therefore it's only chayiv in Shumas and Masros midrabanan. If a Gentile were to buy it or own it, and then own the land, and then you bought produce from him, it would be completely exempt from Shumas and Masros. Now, most of the fruit in Yerushalayim came from Gaza. Most of the residents in Gaza were Gentiles. Therefore, are the fruits in Yerushalayim chayiv in Maser or pater? That's what the Maharit meant. From time immemorial, we always treated the Gaza like Chutz Haaretz. Not that living in Gaza was like living in Chutz Haaretz. No, living in Gaza was like living in Yerushalayim in terms of its Kedusha. But because Ezra never reconquered it, then if a Gentile were to occupy it and we would buy the produce, they would have the capacity to extricate it from being chayiv and Shumas and Masros. Why? Because since Ezra never conquered it, and it's only chayiv in Shumas Midrabanan, when the guy owns it on land which is only chayiv Midrabanan, and we buy it, it's pater. That's what the Maharit meant, that from time immemorial, Gaza was always considered part of Chutz La'aretz. Not in terms of Kedushas Eretz Yisrael, but in terms of if a guy took ownership of it, then Yesh Kayach La'akum La'akar Michiyav Truma Umasar, which is only Midrabanan. But when the Radbaz says that Gaza is halachic status of Eretz Yisrael, he meant living in Gaza has a biblical status of living in Eretz Yisrael, and therefore you'd be chayvin shumas emasros midrabanan since Ezra didn't conquer it. This is how the Rabbi Yaakov Emden reconciles the Maharit with the Radbaz. Again, if land that was conquered by Ezra was owned by a Gentile and you bought the produce, it would be chayiv in shuma masa midairaisa. Ein koyach lachachamim, ein koyach la'akam la'akar, ein kinyan la'akam la'akar. What the Maharit meant was when a guy buys land in the Gaza, which was only chayiv in shuma masa midrabanan, that kinyan could be oiker. So he says, otherwise, but accordingly, if you if you told your wife, listen, we're moving, where are we moving to? We're moving to the 5th floor in Shifa Hospital, we got a really good deal. You could force her. You could force her. You could do it. Or, you could, they just conquered the Supreme Court. They're making nice garden apartments over there, right? Could you go there? You could force her. Is it like living in Eretz Yisrael? It's like living in Yerushalayim. It has Kedushas Eretz Yisrael like live. But the only thing is, land that Goyim occupied in Gaza, Yesh Koicham La'akar Michiyev Chuma Masa, which was Drabanan. But, says Rabbi Yaakov Emden, you cannot say the only reason to live in Eretz Yisrael is because of mitzvahs hatzluyos ba'aretz. He says, Mikamakam leinin kfiyas aliyah she'enu el b'shul mitzvahs hatzluyos by lo ya'amrinan v'hema niflu mimeni. I don't understand such a thing. Where is such an idea mentioned that the only reason to live in Eretz Yisrael is because of the mitzvahs? We only find Moshe Rabbeinu wanted to live in Eretz Yisrael because he wanted to make the mitzvahs hatzluyos ba. He says, Rabbi Yaakov Emden, Haga ba'atzmacha. Many people make aliyah today, but some of them rent. Are you saying if you rent a house in Eretz Yisrael, you're not Mekayim Yishuv Eretz Yisrael because you don't own karka? No, you don't live in Eretz Yisrael to be Mekayim the mitzvahs hatzluyos. There's a mitzvah to live there, irrespective of whether you're being Mekayim the mitzvahs. And therefore, it's not for naught that Chazal speak at length of the great shvach of Eretz Yisrael and the obligation to live there. Okay, that's the opinion of Rabbi Yaakov Emden. Says Rabbi Yaakov Emden, it's pashut that halacha l'maisa, not like the Maharit. You could force your wife to move to Eretz Yisrael, even to the Gaza. The Gaza is full-fledged Kedushas Eretz Yisrael. There's nobody, there are no yeshivas there, there are no Talmid Chachamim there, says Rabbi Yaakov Emden. Who said it's better to live in Chutz La'aretz, where there are Talmid Chachamim, more than living in Eretz Yisrael where there are no Talmid Chachamim? Just the opposite. Chazal say a person should always live in Eretz Yisrael, even Ruba Goyim, and not live in Chutz La'aretz, even Ruba Yisrael. Especially you're going to stay in Mitzrayim, which is Garua Mikol Haratzos. Now what's very interesting is that the Rabbi Yaakov Emden brings an amazing raya that Gaza is part of Eretz Yisrael. He says, we know that HaKadosh Baruch Hu showed Moshe Rabbeinu. He said, you could look at it, but you can't go there. So, what did Hashem show Moshe? Al karchenu tzrichim anu limtzai pesher davar. He says, Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel, Kol shehareu HaKadosh Baruch Hu l'Moshe chai b'maiser. It says, Vayareu Hashem es kol Eretz Yehuda, ad hayom ha'achroin. Hashem showed Moshe all the land of Yehuda until the Mediterranean. So that means Moshe saw Gaza. That means it's chai b'maiser. Because whatever Hashem showed Moshe has a halachic status of Eretz Yisrael proper. So, says Rabbi Yaakov Emden, even though you might ask, that Gaza seems to be Chutz La'aretz from the fact that the Gemara says that someone who lives in Chutz La'aretz, he's like he has no God. Because David HaMelech says, Ki gershuni hayoy mehistapeach benachlas Hashem. God chased me out from taking refuge in the inheritance of Hashem. From which the Gemara learns that if you live in New York, it's like you're worshipping idols. Yeah, you know that Gemara? That if you live in Chutz La'aretz, it's like you're worshipping idols. Why? Because David was considered like he was worshipping idols. Where was David then? In New York? No, he was in Gaza. So says Rabbi Yaakov Emden, doesn't that support the Maharit? That Gaza has the status of Chutz La'aretz? You hear? The whole proof of the Gemara, that Kol Hadar be'Chutz La'aretz, doime k'mi she'ein lo yaloika, is when David ran away to Gaza. And that was even in the time where it was conquered by David. Says the Rabbi Yaakov Emden, it's not a raya. Because at that point in time it was in the hands of the Plishtim. And Achish, the king of Gas, was an idolater. And David ran there to be his slave. And to fight his battles. Even to fight against Klal Yisrael. And Achish made him a guard. So that's like serving Avodah Zarah. Again, not so simple. But this Gemara is something that has to be reckoned with in this sugya. But ultimately, Rabbi Yaakov Emden says that we could bring a very simple raya from the Chumash that living in Eretz Plishtim is like living in Eretz Yisrael without any difference, because we know Yitzchak Avinu was told Gur Ba'aretz Hazois, and he was not allowed to leave because he was in Oila Tamima. And where was he? He was in Gaza, and it was not conquered yet. And even in the times of Avram Avinu, it says, Vayagar Avram ba'aretz Pelishtim Yamim Rabim. And that is the psaka of Rabbi Yaakov Emden. That there is no question that halacha l'maisa, Gaza is full-fledged Eretz Yisrael, legabe kedushas Eretz Yisrael. So whatever is taking place today is not just a matter of the security of the Jewish people. It's not just a matter of protection. It's a matter of not giving up land that Ribbon Shalom gave to Klal Yisrael when he said the words Bereshis bara Elokim. Halacha l'maisa, it is full-fledged Eretz Yisrael. Says Rabbi Yaakov Emden, we await the great day where we know the shita of the Rishonim, that if you take a line horizontally from the north of Eretz Yisrael, from about 35 degrees latitude above the equator to the south about 30 degrees latitude, you make a straight line. It would include all the islands of the sea, Cyprus, Candia, the archipelago, and according to many Rishonim, Aspamia, and a lot of Europe, Spain, Portugal, Morocco. People want to know, why do we go to these countries? Why? Because we like to go, we visit Eretz Yisrael, that's why. All these places are going to be part of Eretz Yisrael. Now you could look on your map where New York is on the latitude. But there is an opinion in the Rishonim that the ultimate borders of Eretz Yisrael will include Chelek Rav min HaAfrika, Barbaria, Morocco, even northern Egypt. It's all part of the land according to Rabbi Yehuda. But be it as it may, halacha l'maisa, it's a machlokes Radbaz and Maharit, but Rabbi Yaakov Emden says that to take the Maharit at face value is impossible, And the fact that the Mishnah and Gittin gives specific borders, that's only regarding Hilchos Gittin, because Hilchos Gittin is dependent on Jewish education. And even Akkay is for sure Eretz Yisrael, but for Gittin it's not. So too Ashkelon is for sure Eretz Yisrael, although for Gittin it's not. And the same thing for Gaza, meaning Legabe Hilchos Gittin, Gaza is like Chutz Haaretz. Legabe Hilchos Kedushas Eretz Yisrael, it's the same as anywhere else in Eretz Yisrael. Rabbi Say, the Rebbe Shem should watch over Klal Yisrael b'chol makom shehem, and we should be zoicha to the nevuah that was told to Yaakov Avinu in this week's parsha, Ufaratzta, Yama, V'kedma, Safayna, V'negva, and we should be zoicha to Nachala B'li Mitzarim. Have a good day, everyone. Yashu Kayach. Baruch Tiyah.